North Korea may in the future more aggressively employ its other weapons of mass destruction and cyber capabilities in peacetime, anticipating that its nuclear shadow would deter many ROK US responses. That is a direct quote from a new report published by the RAND Corporation on Tuesday in partnership with the Asan Institute for Policy Studies, titled Characterizing the Risks of North Korean Chemical and Biological Weapons, Electromagnetic Pulse and Cyber Threats. The report describes how these capabilities could be used to serve the reclusive state's objectives. To learn more about the report, I'm delighted to say that we have the co-author of the report joining us in the studio today. We have with us Dr. Bruce Bennett, who is an adjunct international and defense researcher at the RAND Corporation, and he was in Seoul to stop by today. Dr. Bennett, hello. It's great to see you again.
It's a pleasure to be here.
We appreciate you making the time to visit us today. First off, could you briefly summarize this latest report produced by RAND and the Asan Institute?
So a year ago, we completed a report on the North Korean nuclear weapon threat, showing how it was projecting forward. They keep building nuclear weapons. That has a number of impacts, both directly, but the other part is they aren't getting rid of their chemical and biological weapons. They're mounting greater cyber threats. And with nuclear weapons, when you have a bunch, doing electromagnetic pulse attacks becomes more feasible. So the idea was, let's look at these other things and see how they interrelate with the nuclear threat we had already addressed, in order to suggest what should the U.S. and South Korea be doing about this? Because this is a dangerous situation. If Kim decides he can use chemical weapons against the South because we won't retaliate against him, that's not a situation we want to have develop.
Right, so it is a very comprehensive 120-plus page summary of all the weapons of mass destruction that North Korea has at its disposal, apart from nuclear weapons, but also how they interact with how North Korea might use nuclear weapons. How was this information collected? Because we all know how notoriously secretive the regime is, and sometimes it can be difficult to get an accurate picture of what goes on.
Well, the first thing to recognize is you're just not going to know for sure on anything with regard to North Korea. So you've got to be prepared to work with the information that's out there in the media, with North Korean escapees, with experts in the field. And so we've tried to work across those sources. That means there's significant uncertainty in a lot of these things. Don't really know for sure how much they have in terms of chemical weapons. People say 2,500 to 5,000 tons. That's what the Defense Ministry says. But that's a pretty broad range. And from talking with some North Korean escapees, it could be higher. At least one senior person I talked to said that the North had acquired 2,000 tons of chemical weapons from a part of the former Soviet Union that is normally not accounted for. So these are things which we've tried to go to various sources. We identify the sources. Of the report, almost 30 pages are different sources, just in a bibliography. And we just have to recognize the uncertainty and try and deal with it.
Nuclear weapons are characterized as one type of weapon of mass destruction, or WMD. Other types are chemical, biological, and electromagnetic pulse weapons. These are collectively referred to as other WMD, OWMD in the report. How advanced are North Korea's OWMD capabilities?
Well, we know that in 2017, Kim Jong-un had his half-brother, Kim Jong-nam, killed. He was killed with VX, which is one of the most powerful and deadly chemical weapons. So VX, it takes about 5 milligrams, less than a drop, on your cheek to kill you. And that's what happened to Kim Jong-nam. So this is a very powerful weapon. It's like oil. It doesn't go away once it's dropped on the ground and on cars and so forth. You touch it and you're in deep trouble. So It's not that these are 21st century weapons. VX has been around since shortly after World War II, but they're among the most powerful of the weapons. And that's where we are troublesome. With the diseases like biological weapons, most diseases have been around for a long time, but the stockpiling of them and the ability to use them and make them sometimes is much more difficult. We don't know how far North Korea's gone on those, but we've got a lot of evidence that they've done some things.
You've given us the example of Kim Jong-un's half-brother, Kim Jong-nam, and his assassination with VX. But how much have they been used over there? What's the purpose of amassing these weapons, such as biological and chemical weapons that we've talked about, such as VX?
Well, a lot of the focus on chemical weapons in North Korea started in the 1980s. We believe that North Korea looked at the advances in military technology that the U.S. and South Korea were making, and they realized with their financial resources there was no way they were going to compete. They had to find an alternative. They tried to go for nuclear weapons. They had been trying since the 1950s, and the Soviet Union had largely rebuffed them. So they looked for alternatives, and chemical and biological were something that was out there. They were simpler. They were things they could actually do, and they started assembling them and putting them together as a power. But kind of like the Soviets, once they build a tank, they hardly ever gave it up. They might put it in a reserve somewhere, but they kept building and building more. In many of these areas, we suspect they have built a whole lot. And if Kim goes to war, he is not going to hold back on anything that might give him an advantage.
So it's about holding that for now and then perhaps using that as a threat, really, just to keep hold of it for now, rather than it being used currently. So these are weapons that are perhaps very limited use at the moment, but they serve to raise the North's military capabilities. Another weapon that the regime is using, though, very much so, is cyber attacks, and that's another major topic that the report examines. Can you briefly walk us through the evolution of the state's cyber capabilities? How advanced is it now?
North Korea started 20, 30 years ago recognizing that this was an area where they could gain an advantage. You look at 20 years ago and the statements of a very small program, but which was growing. They got Russian help in terms of training some of their people. They start choosing children in elementary school and train them through all of their basic school and in the university. Then they send them over to play school overseas to places like China. Tell them to go work in a company and do the best they can for that company as a programmer during the day, and at night have them hack. So this is a fairly sophisticated system because the Chinese companies love them. They're inexpensive, do good programming work, but it gives them access. And with any kind of skill, some of them do really, really well, some not so well. And so you got to use them in order to determine who it is who's going to develop the really sophisticated capability. They've had decades now to do that. And they've got some apparently pretty impressive people. I mean, they've stolen what? Just recently from one company, $600 million in cryptocurrency? That's huge.
So what's different, I guess, with cyber attacks between OWMDs and cyber attacks is that cyber is very much used at the moment, right?
Exactly. Cyber is very much used at the moment. The concern we have is if Kim has a lot of nuclear weapons, more than he needs for defensive purposes, he gets to the point where he can start using other things more aggressively. He hasn't really been using chemicals other than a couple of assassination attempts, but maybe he broadens that and goes after some companies, goes after some individuals. He might do it with a biological weapon because he figures it's going to be hard to attribute to him, to catch him. And we really worry that that could be the future that we've got to defend against.
That takes us back to that quote I mentioned at the very beginning of this interview. North Korea may in the future more aggressively employ its OWMDs and cyber capabilities in peacetime, anticipating that its nuclear shadow would deter South Korea and US responses. Can you expand a bit more on those?
Sure. The nuclear shadow is a term that experts have developed to say that once a company has a serious nuclear force, they can do things more aggressively. So look at what happened in Ukraine. In Ukraine, the Russians invade the Ukraine, and they tell the West, don't you dare get involved, because if you do, we could use nuclear weapons. And so initially, the U.S. holds back, the European countries hold back. We don't really provide Ukraine very much support. But gradually, we started testing that and providing more and more. The worry is, even in Ukraine, at some point, Putin could be in enough trouble that he escalates. And that's the kind of case where that nuclear umbrella is there. We've chosen to defy it. But at some point in time, he may still exercise it.
So what do you think we need to take away from your report then? What was the aim that you had? Understand that there are recommendations for South Korea and the US to prepare for and find ways to perhaps deter North Korea's use of these weapons.
There was an ancient Roman philosopher who said, if you want peace, prepare for war. Now, he didn't want to go to war, but he said, if you're ready to fight a war, your enemies aren't going to attack you because they know they'll lose. And so the philosophy there is we've got to be prepared to deal with North Korea if it uses these things. So let me give you a simple example. North Korea flies a drone over the National Assembly and drops a biological weapon or a chemical weapon, continues over KBS and down Yoido. If you're in a building like this, you need to have overpressure in the building. So when the doors open, you need to be hit with a gust of air, stronger than basic atmospheric pressure, because that keeps the chemical or the biological weapon out. But nobody's doing that.
Sure, that would... How do you prepare for that? I mean,
well,
that
you
would...
just have to put in a stronger air conditioning system. I mean, it's...
Is it that simple?
It is really that simple, yeah. Yeah, I mean, you have to have the right filters, but most buildings nowadays have really good filters. So there's some simple things you can do. There are more sophisticated things. You know, the Korean government talks about their three-axis system: kill chain, the Korean air and missile defense, and the Korean massive punishment and retaliation. Those are all good things we ought to have in the pocket as well. North Korea, when they built their Scud missiles, they built 5 or 10 missiles per launcher. So even if they got away with the first launch of missiles, if you have an ability to go out and attack the storage facilities of those missiles, you can destroy 80 to 90% of them. So the kill chain isn't just a preemptive kind of thing. It can be used after an initial attack. And, you know, you want to reduce fatalities in South Korea by 10 or 15 million? Kind of sounds like it's worthwhile to me to have that kind of capability.
You seem to, how should I put it, perhaps paint quite a bleak picture of North Korea's threats, perhaps what they're willing to do, what they're capable to do. How realistic is it at this point? How seriously should we take this threat?
Back many, many years ago, the defector Hwang Jung-yup came out of North Korea. He was the most senior defector we've seen to date, as far as I know. And the first American who interviewed him asked him, "What do you know about chemical weapons?" And he said, "Not too much." Then asked him, "Well, do you think they're important to North Korea?" And Hwang turned to him and said, "North Korea is not a rich country. We're a poor country. If we spend money on something, we plan to use it. Now, I don't think that means that Kim Jong-un's going to wake up some morning and say, great day to go to war, let's go south. But I think he could wake up some morning and say, I think the military's about to rebel against me. So I'm going to order them to go south so they don't go towards Pyongyang and take me down. And that's the concern, is if we have instability in North Korea, which today we have a fair amount, we need to be worried that this may be his escape route of trying to regain control in those kinds of situations.
Well, hopefully we'll never have to deal with that sort of worst case scenario, but the threat remains, and that is unfortunately the situation that hangs above us, and this report is a stark reminder of that, I guess. Well, Dr. Bennett, thank you for stopping by and walking us through that report. We've been speaking to Dr. Bruce Bennett from the RAND Corporation. We appreciate your time today.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.